Our day today is going to look a little like what you see on the screen. So just a little bit of introduction to the rest of my team who's supporting and behind me on the project, and a little bit of history lesson where we've been with the children's garden and then where we're going. So we're going to share some of the plans and talk about where we're currently at, because we're kind of in the middle of a process, a design development process right now. So these are not by any means final plans. You're just sort of seeing a cross section of where we are to date. And then we'll take a deep dive into each of these garden rooms in the children's garden expansion. And we'll look at some of the design features and stories. Brace yourself, because it's going to be very graphic heavy. There's a lot of technical information that goes into a project like this, but really today is more about color and life and ambiance and the quality of the spaces. So we're gonna keep it at a very graphic, colorful level, and I hope you enjoy it. And then we'll wrap up with timeline and schedule and some of our next steps. And as Jack mentioned, we'll set aside a good 20-30 minutes for Q&A, and that will be moderated through the chat function during that period, again, as Jack mentioned, and then just some final wrap up at the end. So a little bit about my team and our team from SmithGroup. So this is the cast of characters working on the project, and there's actually quite a few more who aren't on the screen. So on the screen, you have architects, you have civil engineers, landscape architects, designers, and some of these faces like Tom and Jesse, you may recognize if you've been involved in any of the previous garden projects at Green Bay Botanical, including the Grand Garden, which was something that both Tom and Jesse were involved in. Tom will be joining us shortly. I don't think he's on quite yet. He apologizes. He had a conflict at the beginning here, but he's also going to be jumping on our call in a little bit. And here's some of the design work we've done with you in the recent past, that Grand Garden, and what a wonderful space that is, a space that we're very proud to have been a part of. So, because I'm gonna have the mic for next hour or so here, I'm gonna try to move through the content, but it's always good, I think, to know human to human who's talking and a little bit of who I am. So there's my family in the upper left. I have two kids of my own, and they're 4 and 8 right now. That's a picture of us at Allen Centennial Garden in Madison, where we live. And in the lower right, that's, as Jack kind of uh, presented in his intro for me, it's just a view of my backyard. And I thought it was very fitting because my own backyard here is an intersection of play and ornamental plantings, and then just at the bottom of that yellow slide is my vegetable garden. So you have all these things coming together in one space, and on a much smaller scale or on a much grander scale, that's kind of what we're doing here today with this project. And then a couple of the other images you see are examples of some of my work selected from the sort of the Fox Valley area. So the upper right is in Menasha. That lower left one is along the river in Kaukauna. So that's just a brief glimpse of me. And now let's take a look at our space in the garden. So these are some images. I'm guessing a lot of you on the call today are very familiar with this space and this garden. But just in case you're not, and you need some visuals to kind of help place us there, especially nice green leafy ones to make us all feel better today. You can see in the lower left here the outline of the garden as a whole, with Larson Road wrapping the south edge. And then that outline, the yellow outline, is the children's garden. More specifically, our expansion project is keeping most of the existing children's garden intact. And that space is characterized, especially when you look at it from a satellite, by this spoke wheel configuration in the 2-story pavilion that's in the middle of that space. And then you can see some of those aerial images of what it looks like. And then once we go back down to the ground, these are some of the photos of the space to help you visualize the children's garden as it exists today. Here's that 2-story pavilion in the upper left. Another familiar feature is the Hobbit house and the restrooms in the upper center. And there's other like really wonderful pieces to this garden. Mr. McGregor's garden with his shed and the vegetable garden and some of these lovely little spaces under pergolas. Also on the far right, you might see the hoop house, which was the butterfly garden most recently in that space. That is part of our project area. Although the hoop house has since come down, I think just late this last year, to make room for additional improvements in this project. So in terms of the children's garden, where we've been, this was the most recent plan that was the launching point for the work that we're doing. And this was a concept plan that through some stakeholder workshops, probably a lot of you on the call today, and some interactions with children and garden staff, we developed this concept plan hand in hand with you. And this is really the basis for what we're doing in the beginning of this evolution. Actually, to just maybe go back beyond this, this was even further back envisioned as an expansion project in some of the garden master plans. So I think reaching back maybe to around 2010, 2011, the master plan for the garden started to envision improvements to this space and an expansion to the children's garden. And since then, incremental projects have definitely happened. The Hobbit house and some of the fun things that have happened there have occurred. And then that launched us into this concept plan. Some of the design goals for this plan are listed there on the left. And I won't necessarily read through all of those, but these are maybe something to keep in mind and how successful we're meeting some of these goals. And we can talk about that and comment on that at the end of the presentation. So the plan itself is characterized by these different component spaces. So starting with number 1 on the top of the screen, there's a gateway space. Most visitors to the garden come down from the northeast, and that would be an artistic element in a space to really welcome you both into the existing children's garden and the new expansion. Next to that is a raindrop garden. And then as we move along, I might have to move my faces are all off on this side of the screen. There we go. So as we move along, there was a wetland deck, the stream terrace, mushroom jumper play, vegetable garden. Some of the existing slide tower features are at number 7 with the center pavilion. A lily pad splash play is number 8. And then you see this network of tree houses that climb up the hillside. And then the amphitheater at number 10. And then scattered throughout, but especially up in this hillside where I'm circling with my mouse right now, are a lot of natural play elements, creative play. And then back on this back side of the hillside. So this right here where I'm circling is a lot of like undulating topography, which is a really unique amenity. And you'll see this in some of the upcoming images, but it's a perfect space for this amphitheater and for kids to kind of get dirty, run around, play with some of the natural elements and explore this topography. And then 12 and 13, I mentioned the cave play and some of the other things happening back there. Up here at 14 and 15, we have a flex lawn and a shade structure or a pavilion. And then lastly, coming back down to number 16 was a maintenance shed. And this process kicked off with a schematic design verification of the plan back in August. And these are just a few of the comments that we heard. We had a great kickoff meeting with the steering committee and got a lot of really great information through that site tour and through that process. And then I think the other thing that really characterizes what this garden space will be is this idea, which has become the driving concept of inspire fantasy, woodland fantasy. And that's even morphed into more specifically biophilic fantasy, where art plays an incredibly important part in this role of creating an imaginative space where kids and adults can kind of wander through it and find a new story, find a new adventure just around every corner. They can make these discoveries. They can interact with these things that are maybe larger than life. And it's all tied to play, but it's also tied to plant life, and there's this connection of nature and art and play all in one space. Some of the materiality that we would like to express is again really of nature. The forms and the materials are all derived and really reinforcing the garden's mission of connecting people to plants. And then we stepped back and really distilled this concept plan and back into kind of a bubble diagram of basic ideas and a basic framework. One thing that we were very conscious of is that the garden expansion doesn't want to feel like a separate garden or a separate space from the existing children's garden. That the two want to relate to each other and be connected. And there's certainly going to be garden rooms within these spaces and transitions and thresholds, but it wants to feel like a cohesive space. And so it was important that there was a guiding organization to that idea. And the way that that has expressed itself is the existing garden being kind of this middle area with the two-story pavilion serving as almost like the town center. And then the outer areas where the expansion project is happening is more of the wild area. So we have the bog in this space to the north, which is a little bit lower in topography. There's actually a delineated wetland that passes through that space. It's a little bit flatter. And then on the opposite end, you have that hillside I was mentioning. We have undulating topography and a lot of tree canopy, and that's the wild and the forest play. And then a couple of these linking spaces are the transitions between the wild and between the town center. And this cultivated transition, which is the field, and the park pavilion, which all sit along the edge of both the wild and of the town. And again, just to kind of give you a glimpse of our process and the work we've been doing over the last few months, our design process is very iterative. We've gone through a lot of trace paper and a lot of sketching. Of course, now that this last year, everything has become more virtual and digital, we've been doing a lot of things virtually and in 3D and computer modeling of the space so we can actually get a sense of what it feels like to stand in the garden design. We've also had a lot of interaction with our steering committee and garden staff, and specifically on certain topics such as the tree houses and what the tree house theme is and what that looks like. And what things do we value? What what program are we accommodating in some of these spaces. So that leads us to where we're going and some of our current plans. So here's our current site plan on our screen. For some of you who may have been involved with some of the artist selection process in our steering committee, you've seen glimpses of this, but probably not anything described holistically or quite up to date as this graphic on your screen. So we're very excited about how the plan is developing and how these spaces are developing. And in comparison to that concept plan that I showed you a few slides back, done in 2019, we've taken some of the feedback we've heard from our steering committee, and we've done a slight reorganization of some of the spaces. There's been a little bit of consolidation. So things like the lily pad splash and the mushroom jumper have kind of switched places to better respond to the sequence and the order in which you might experience them, but also the topography and some of those physical constraints of the site. And I know this slide has a lot of words, and not expecting us to read all these words. That's always a big no-no, right? To put all these text and words on a presentation slide, but just want to demonstrate for you at a high level that what we're doing today and what we've been doing lately is taking a look at each space and what the story is in each space, what the capacity is, what the program is, if there's a classroom, if there's a family visiting, you know, what size and scale is appropriate to the type of functions that are happening in each of these garden rooms. And there's a lot of really fun stories that are starting to develop through this plan. And a handful of those stories are going to be largely shaped by the work of some of our artists. So I know several of our artists are on the call here today, and we are really excited to work with these folks. Um, these are incredibly talented people, and I think they're going to contribute and bring a lot of value, both to the process, but also the final product and their work. So you can see the 4 locations that we've identified as focal points for art and art proposals. Currently in that process, we've selected these 4 artists to look at these 4 areas, and they are just starting to look at specific proposals, so specific art proposals for these specific sites. And some of the images that I'll continue to show are imaginative of what might be, but the artwork might be depicted in some of these is just sort of a placeholder for now. It's not yet real. And I'm so excited to work with these folks and see some of their ideas and how they shape these spaces. Here's just a glimpse of some of their work. So these are the specific artists and some of their specific works that we've grabbed. And you can see just the talent and the wonderful artwork they produce, all of which really layers experience into their art. It layers imagination, it layers story and education. Also, a lot of these, we could probably, and I'm sure they could as well, go into quite a bit of detail talking about the story and the educational piece behind each of these. So these are representative of the types of things that they'll be proposing for our specific site. All right, I'm now gonna step us through some of the rooms and we've been looking at the plan on our screen at sort of like a 40 scale, and we're going to jump in and look at things at 10 scale next. And as I do that, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind here. So I mentioned earlier, most people enter our garden from that northeast corner, and there's a certain sequence of experiences that we're anticipating. However, the garden is very connected, and there's a lot of paths that bring you to different places throughout the garden. And we need to acknowledge that people might enter from different paths in different locations. Even if they do come from the northwest, which most will, they might reach our gateway and they might choose to follow the green line to the existing garden. So that's something to keep in mind. The sequence in which I'm going to pass through our spaces is kind of a choreographed movement following this red line, and how we anticipate a lot of people entering the garden, that they will reach the gateway space and that they will actually follow through on this red line. And there's a couple moments here where, again, there will be choices where they have to choose their own adventure, and they are able to follow the blue line, but they're also able to follow the purple line, or they're able to even like kind of switch back and go into the existing garden where the green lines are. And that's very intentional. We want it to be very well connected, but we also think there's an opportunity here that you might come and visit the garden one weekend, and a couple months from now, you might come again and experience the garden in a whole new way, and you might see it in a whole new light. And even by taking kind of the pathway in reverse, you might find things you didn't find the previous time. And I think that's an exciting opportunity, that this garden is layered with some complexity and options that keeps you coming back. So I'm going to start us back up here, going backwards, up by the gateway in the space that we've called the Raindrop Garden, and take a closer look at this space. And I will acknowledge right off the bat here, the gateway being one of those 4 locations that an artist will develop artwork for. This is kind of a hypothetical site sketch of what that space might be. But because the artist proposal is not yet in hand, we anticipate that that artwork, whatever form and shape that it takes, might kind of change the development of this specific place in this garden room. So for that reason, there's some detail that's maybe lacking in this space, just to allow the artwork to get ahead of us in terms of process. But generally speaking, in addition to the gateway, the Raindrop Garden is envisioned as a space where we're able to tell the story of what happens to a drop of water and the path of that water. It's really important to know kind of the water that falls from the sky, where it's going, how long it takes to get somewhere. And there's a lot of impacts on us and the environment in that stormwater, in the path of the stormwater. So we envision this as a gathering space for a classroom size group of people, 20 to 30 people, where there's a feature that actually collects rainwater, and you're allowed to kind of open the gate and let that rainwater discharge. So picture kind of like an ornamental rain barrel, if you have a rain barrel at home, something that collects water from the sky and stores it. And there's usually some sort of like little valve to that element, and you can release the water, and maybe you release it for your garden or some other reason. So in this case, we're able to capture it in an artistic manner and release it into this feature, this runnel feature, which is very playful. As a kid, I always loved kind of channeling water, and whether it was stormwater or water from a pool, and watching that water kind of take this path. And sometimes you could manipulate the paths. You could put a little stick or a boat in it to watch how fast it moves. And that's the type of experience that we're seeing here in this space. couple images of what I've just described are in that lower left-hand corner, where you can see a runnel type feature. Some of this one has stone along the edges. This one's more of a precast or shaped stone material. But how engaging and how fun. I know my kids would love to, I would love to play in this type of space as well. And then I think there's all sorts of other little details we can layer into this to emphasize and reinforce this idea and this beauty of raindrops falling from the sky. And it might be as simple as what we're doing in the paving patterns and the materials that we're using in the paving to tell that story. Switching to a model view, this is looking from up above, and you'll notice that there's not a lot of detailed rendered in this image for that reason I said before, that it's still very much a work in progress. And this being the Raindrop Garden, this being the gateway space, and we're anticipating some sort of large artwork feature in that space that welcomes you into the garden, possibly arching over the path. So these are actual site photos down on the ground again. This one on the left is looking east from the existing garden path. And what I've circled there is roughly where the Raindrop Garden and the gateway would be located. And then moving just a little bit further up the path, you can see the existing bridge and the lovely vegetated arbor that arcs over that bridge as an existing gateway feature that already is there and welcomes you into the children's garden. And then the new gateway and the Raindrop Garden being again in the purple magenta line just on the right hand side of the screen. The Wetland Deck would be the next deck in the sequence of experiences if you pass through the gateway into the garden expansion. So this is a space that could accommodate, again, like a larger classroom size group, and could have tables and chairs for picnicking or seating. Maybe it's lunchtime for a field trip, and it would be a decking material. Right now, there is a wetland that passes through under this deck space, and we'll be using that wetland as stormwater management and controlling the amount of water runoff that falls on the site. And as a technical detail, we've already started our conversation with the DNR, and I believe we've actually even received approval for manipulating that wetland to take on additional stormwater. Today, it's not a very high quality wetland, so it'll remain as a wetland aesthetic and what passes through, if you follow my mouse, underneath this deck. But it will take on a slightly different volume and a slightly different planting, a more ornamental planting scheme than it is today. It's a pretty much a natural area currently in this space that you see on the screen. So the deck helps bridge us over that wetland swale, but it also creates a level platform as a gathering space. Some of the neat opportunities here are to tell the story of plants and wetland plants, maybe even carnivorous plants or things that you would find in more of a bog type setting or a wetter landscape. And we see this as a space where those plants really creep right into the deck, that you're really immersed in the plantings, and that the deck has a back edge and you're able to sit along that back edge, and it really holds you in a very pleasant space. Again, immersed in the plantings. And that image, I think in the upper left here, is an image from Naval Cemetery in Brooklyn, and it captures really accurately sort of the vision that we have for this deck and that aesthetic, although the seating might be slightly different. This is what that space would look like upon entry. The camera here would be standing kind of underneath the gateway feature. and looking into the wetland deck, and then the lily pad splash just beyond that. There's an image of what that area looks like today. Again, this is looking east. There's a lower area with a couple picnic tables. This is the wetland as it exists today. It's just this kind of swale that you see in the image. So that moves us to our next garden room and our next space. So immediately adjacent the wetland deck is our lily pad splash area. I'm really excited about this space. Brian, who's on the call today, is our artist who will be helping us develop the story and craft the space for the lily pad splash. The story here, I think, started as lily pads and probably the life cycle of the frog, and now it's expanding into, well, how do plants and animals compose this ecosystem and this food chain of the northern Wisconsin lakes? So there's an opportunity here to show sort of from vegetative life to plankton and frogs and insects and birds, how everything is tied together and connected. And you do that with a fun water feature that's in the middle. And you're standing amidst the art, and you have this parent, that the wetland deck almost serves as an overlooking parent patio. You also have a couple other areas here that parents can kind of pull off to the side if they don't feel like interacting with water themselves. They have a safe space to stay dry. We don't see this as like a grand fountain that's shooting water 20 feet into the air. Rather, this is a place for sort of subtle bubbling or smaller sprays of water that kids can interact with. But we know a lot of visitors are coming to the garden not necessarily here to get wet or here with their swimming suits. So it's a safe space to kind of interact with water, to see the story of how creatures and plants all live together. And some of the details that come together to make this space are really gonna shine, and I think it's gonna be a really fun space for both kids and parents. Here's another a view from down at the ground inside the model. So just a couple of words about the model images that I show you. The planting palette that is available to us in this kind of software is very limited, so you have to kind of squint when you see some of the plantings. But the topography that's represented is all real. It's based on a real survey and real conditions. So it's really great to kind of get a feel for the scale and the undulation of the space. But sometimes, like with the plants, you have to squint a little to see it. Here's looking backwards from the opposite angle, again, looking to the east. And again, a couple shots of that area as it exists today. So that moves us on to our next space. How's everyone doing? Good. Thumbs up. All right, good. I'm doing a lot of talking, which feels odd for me. I like to listen more than talk, so I'll keep going. But I think as a moment to pause here and as a reminder, there will be a Q&A towards the end. And I think you probably have the ability to write things in chat even now. So if there's things that you're questioning or you're wondering or comments you have, by all means, you can start writing those in the chat, and we'll moderate those as we go. But yeah, feel free. I might answer some of your questions as I go, but definitely feel free to write any comments or questions in the chat. So the field, you may recall from the bubble diagram that the field, this space was a transitional space. So it comes just off screen up here. It comes directly off of Mr. McGregor's garden and the space, the existing space that's themed after the Peter Rabbit story. And we contemplated early in the concept design process whether to recreate that feature in Mr. McGregor's garden, to kind of pull it out and relocate it in the expansion project. But we decided ultimately that I feel like there's a lot of value in that space. I think it's a fun, playful area of the existing garden. And rather than displacing it and moving it or recreating it, we're building off of it. And it's this metaphor of again, the town garden or the kitchen garden that's right there next to someone's home, Mr. McGregor's home in this case. But if you pass through the fence and you pass through the hedge, you start to enter the field, sort of like the back 40. And you start to venture into areas that are a little more wild. So this is envisioned still as a vegetable garden, but as a different form than Mr. McGregor's garden. It's a place where maybe crop vegetables or other vegetables form this lovely pattern and motif and reinforce the geometry. I think the fields of Wisconsin naturally have this kind of beautiful aesthetic in the way that rows are organized, whether you're driving past them or running through them or flying over top of them. I've always found that to be very interesting. And so this is quite literally kind of a spin on that imagery and taking those garden rows and spinning it into this spiral. I also mentioned previously how this is a location for one of our artist proposals. So again, I think I'm showing you some of our initial ideas, but this space will be very much shaped by the vision of Matthew Mazzota and the artist and some of the work that he does. And I'm really excited to see how some of his work folds the story and the aesthetic and the ambiance of the space all together. That patterning of planting could look something like this. This is something that might be actual activity for kids or field trips, classrooms. Sometimes what I've experienced with my own kids and field trips I've been on with them is you might mark out sort of the arrangement or the line of the planting and you set it up for them and that they're able to actually do the planting themselves. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, there's something so rewarding about getting your hands in the earth and doing that. And I think that's especially important with this next generation of kids and young ones. And that's really what I see the garden being all about, is really allowing kids to reconnect with nature and with planting. At the center of this space right now, we're kind of envisioning like a farm well type feature. However, that as a focal point, I think might flux depending on the artist's proposal. And there's a chance it could be replaced as a feature or change kind of in form. We'll see what happens in the next couple of months. Here's our model view down on the ground of what that space looks like. Just off to the right here, you see a representation of the existing fence. There's an ornamental black fence that contains the existing garden. And you see it in this image and some of the upcoming images, how we think there's an opportunity there to create a garden hedge and reinforce the geometry of the fence, but also penetrate through the fence in a few new locations so that you're very well connected to the interior spoke wheel of the existing garden. But that it gives you a little bit of mystery and almost like a threshold or a door as you enter from one garden room to the next. Here we go. This image kind of describes what I was talking about even better. So this pathway here is actually an existing opening in the fence that if you were in by the two-story pavilion or Mr. McGregor's garden, currently today, if you pass through here, it would be a mostly natural area and just the beginning of the wetland off to the right. And so we're penetrating that in a few new locations, and you see the swirl of the planting could be very eye-catching. And then, of course, I have to acknowledge sort of the next space that is up here in the upper left, and the mushroom jumper and some of the tree houses, which are yet another super fun and exciting feature of the garden design. This is that image in the upper right is what it looks like today and roughly the location of the vegetable garden and the field. Make mental note here of this existing tree, this large pin oak tree, because this is a really beautiful tree. So obviously there are some tree removals happening to make the garden expansion project work. There's a lot of shaping of the land to make accessibility work, but there are a lot of trees that we're saving, and I'm all about saving trees. So this is probably the most notable one and really serves as a great kind of benchmark, mental benchmark of where we are. It's a large pin oak with a lovely canopy, and you can see in the background, this is the hillside and the topography that I was describing more. The Hobbit house is screened behind some of the vegetation off to the right. But this is some of the topography and the tree canopy that is a huge asset to the garden design and something that's really been integrated into the spaces. Another shot from the air. Oh, sorry, a couple duplicates. Here we go. So the mushroom jumper and woodland play. This is the next space in our sequence of experiences. And that large pin oak tree is this large tree you see on the right side. We're trying to carve a generous area of the site, or leave a generous area of the site intact to protect the root zone of that pin oak. But we also see maybe some less invasive features happening under that oak tree, some nature play features like stumps and logs, things which don't need a lot of disruption or footings or penetration into the root zone of that tree. And then on the top of it, we're creating a wider path and a couple different materials for, again, like a parent pull-off space. The mushroom jumper is probably the most active play area in the garden expansion, where it's closest to what we would consider kind of a playground, where there's a lot of play equipment and play features. And with that, it's important to always remember the parents and where the parents go, because sometimes I'm definitely going to be in here playing with my kids, but sometimes I also just need a moment and I'll be standing off to the side. So yeah, there's a lot of, actually there's a lot of technical detail that goes into the design of this space. And this is, again, very preliminary. With all the play equipment, there's fall zones and spatial relationships that you need to make sure from a safety perspective, this all works. But I think the exciting thing here is, again, that you're tying to a story that is interesting to parents and kids, and the parents, the parents might read into it at a deeper level, and the kids might just see, oh, like mushrooms and undulating rubber surfaces. Let's go play and have fun. But layered into that, again, as with all these spaces, there's a story and there's a theme here. And the story being that there's a lot of life that happens on the forest floor. And that's literally where we're at. We're at the forest floor. We're at the foot of the hill where there's a lot of trees and canopy. And there's going to be opportunities in some of these design features and details to represent mushrooms and insects and all the different things that happen in that forest floor. I think there's maybe even an opportunity to connect to the previous space in the field and some of the composting that currently happens with some of the vegetable gardening and the role that mushrooms and fungi play in composting. Some of the specific features you're seeing here. So the big one that stands out obviously is the kind of the purple network, which is the tree houses that start to climb out of this space. Purple is just a representative color, so don't take that too literally. The blue color that you see as the base, again, is just representative as a color. It could be blue. It might not actually be blue. It might be multiple colors. That's to be determined. But it's anticipated as a poured in place rubber surfacing that's a very safe play surfacing. It's also highly engaging, and even as adults, I think it's very fun to step on this kind of surface. You also see climbing nets connecting up to the treehouse structure, some slides that come down from those structures. There will be undulating mounds within this space. There's some really fun mushroom themed musical play equipment that might be layered into this, where it looks like a mushroom, but you have a little baton and a rod and you can make music with it. I think there's also a fun opportunity to use play equipment to represent the many forms of mushrooms. So sometimes they're more of globes like these poured in place rubber balls, and sometimes they're more layered, like with this feature on the top. This might be layers of a material to represent those layered mushrooms and become almost like a little stage type space. Here's a view looking down from the tree houses. See the vegetable garden in the field here, Mr. McGregor's garden, the existing garden off to the left. Larson Road is back here on the right and in the background. And there will be additional plantings that will be layered into that buffer space along the edges to still allow some windows of view from Larson Road into the garden expansion, but also help create some buffer and some edge. Excuse me. Here's a couple of shots, excuse me, of what that space looks like, where the mushroom jumpers and the woodland play would be. All right, so the tree houses. This is a pretty major feature of the garden, and I'm going to devote a few more slides here to the tree houses. And we've had a lot of discussion about tree houses. I grew up playing in tree houses and building tree houses and tree forts as a kid. I'm sure a lot of you did too. I think there's inherently something very compelling about being up in the trees, being up in the canopy, being up in a space that you can kind of claim as your own and let your imagination run. So the plan is developed. It's refined from a series of 7 tree houses to now 5. It's a interconnected series of experiences. The tree houses themselves will all be accessible, ADA accessible. So there's going to be a couple ways of accessibly getting up to them. One would be from this path that wraps around the blue mushroom jumper area and brings you up to a launching platform. This would be a flat platform. And then from there, it ramps up to the kind of the hub of the tree houses, which is this one at the top. And as you'll see in some of the next few slides, this one is again connected by an accessible path that comes from the west. And then these are all accessible connections, so kind of flat bridges to each other. And we've done a lot of research into tree houses and children's gardens and other similar type spaces around the country, around the world. And in a lot of ways, this was super fun, but also super challenging because the sky's the limit, and there's a lot of different forms and stories that the tree houses could take. And I think it's important to note that the connection between the tree houses is not necessarily just a path from A to B, that the connections themselves are part of the tree house experience. And then here's a great precedent study, and you can see some of the educational things and stories that this project did inside of those tree houses. So the interest in the tree houses is both visually from the ground or even from the road and from the distance to see them perched up in the trees, but also maybe more importantly, what it's like to enter inside of these. And from there, one of the images I showed you, one of the slides previously was of our charrette for the tree houses. And we discussed a lot of different concepts and ideas, whether these were a series of very different looking structures, all patterned after a different habitat or creature home, whether one was a beehive or a birdhouse or a spider web. Um, or whether they were more of a family, if they were all of sort of one idea and had a very similar experience with slightly different stories and activities inside of them. But ultimately, what we landed on is uh, the garden is about, the mission of the garden is to connect people to plants. And let's use the tree houses to really focus on plants. And there is a connection here to humans and animal life, but the metaphor and the focus is actually on the tree and the life of the tree, and then how that life branches out and affects other things. So how it is impactful as a habitat, how trees themselves are curiosities and some of the different forms and growths, whether it's benign or disease that um, if you walk through the woods, maybe sometimes we don't notice them, but there's all sorts of little interesting curiosities happening that from both a form and an educational piece are very compelling. Trees at risk. I mentioned disease and the emerald ash borer and the impact that that's had on Wisconsin's canopy and forest. Trees as commodities and the tie to history and the logging industry and the impact that logging has made on northern Wisconsin. And again, trees and how it connects to us and economy and paper, pulp mills and paper still being a very prominent piece of Wisconsin and part of Wisconsin's story. And interestingly, this idea of trees as industry and as paper and then the folds of paper launched us into some of the forms and geometries that you'll be seeing. So here's those 5 things I just covered and how they start to express themselves as a interconnected, branching experience. And just kind of as a simple diagram, how that lays out as the treehouse circulation pattern. And then this is that image that you saw glimpses of already of the actual form of the tree houses. And this is still, I'll admit, very much a work in progress. A lot of the ideas you see here have really only developed in the last week or two. So I think there's still a lot of refinement that will happen ahead of us. I mentioned we're in the design development phase now, and there's a construction documentation phase that is ahead of us, which will launch further into the engineering and some of the technical details of all the features, but especially the tree houses. But what I find really compelling about this idea and the form that these tree houses are taking is that it really reads as a single organism that lives in the trees, that's coming out of the trees, instead of each tree house being its own little thing connected by bridges, that it is a cohesive experience, and that the bridges and the pathways between them are all part of sort of one treehouse superstructure. There's that image again where you can see from that same vantage looking up into the canopies of the hill. This is looking from the west end of the existing garden. This railing that you see off on the left-hand side is the existing approach up to the two-story pavilion that's at the center of the spoke wheel in the existing garden. And then this is the ADA approach from the hillside, the back of the hill. A lot of the detail of the actual play equipment in the mushroom jumper space is not depicted yet. And this is again that image as if you were coming down from the pavilion in the center of the existing garden. There's that actual image today. This is what it might look like from Larson Road. Obviously, I think some of the planting will look different, and this is just a placeholder for now along that edge. Again, from Larson Road. All right, that moves us to the next space. This is the Council of Critters, or the amphitheater. It's a really beautiful bowl-shaped space in the existing topography. Most of the topography here is really being left in place, and we're layering natural chunks of limestone into the hillside to create kind of an informal woodland amphitheater setting. This was our fourth space that artists will be looking at, and Studio Wow House will be taking a closer look at crafting this experience of a council of critters and what that means and how that actually plays out. The initial vision here is that you have a lower stage type or outdoor classroom type space, and then that you have some sculptures or art that you actually sit alongside, and you feel like you can be sitting right next to a badger or a bear or a rabbit, and everyone's kind of looking down at this stage space, but it really puts you right into the cast of characters of the artwork. This is just a initial artist rendering of the ambiance and the quality of that space. This is the Hobbit house that's tucked into the hillside in the background. And this is all, this rendering, this image is actually based on the actual topography from the model of the site. So it's real topography, it's the real hillside. It's a fairly accurate view despite how cartoonish it looks. And now here's a view from the ground in the actual model. Obviously, a big component of the space is the artwork and the sculptures, which aren't yet depicted. And then in that photo, you can see what that looks like today. A lot of these trees in this hillside are pin oaks. There's handful of box elders and ash and poplars. And then moving just a little further west from the amphitheater is the next space. And this is the cave play in the hillside escarpment. So the story here began with the need, the functional need to accessibly get people up to the tree houses. So there was a path that really, there was only one of two locations you could accessibly get up here. And this was one of them. And this path wrapping around the back of the hillside to get you to the tree houses and the top of the amphitheater. But this would be a lost opportunity if it was just sort of a back path, access path. So we're launching off of the Hobbit house just to the right and creating this as another amenity space. And this is envisioned as a space for younger kids, maybe a 2 to 5 year old play space, where we're actually building up a little additional topography and earth off of the hillside and placing a tunnel through the hill. So there's a tunnel that you can pass through. It's going to be a fairly large tunnel, but still very mysterious and playful and fun. It's purposefully a straight line tunnel, so it's not like a deep cave where it's necessarily dark or it doesn't curve where you wouldn't be able to see your kids kind of on the other side of it. So we're definitely keeping safety in mind. If your kid passes through and you're a parent, you're able to see straight over to them where they come out on the other side, and then it's just a quick bend around. But the whole hillside kind of being this back and forth play through the tunnel. Again, some of that blue play surfacing represented here. And then the story here is about our Great Lakes and the edge of the Great Lakes and the Niagara Escarpment that is this unique geological feature connecting Green Bay and Wisconsin over through Canada and through the Great Lakes all the way over to New York. And this very unique stone, the dolomitic limestone that composes that Niagara Escarpment, and using some of that weathered edge stone to build up the edge and retain the hillside, but also to create some of these ledges and pockets that overhang the tunnel itself, much like this image. I can't remember if this is Lake Michigan or Superior, but much like that image that is familiar to us along the Great Lakes and the experience of moving along that lake shoreline. And just like the image shows, it would be really fun to have a little playboat in that space, especially for younger kids. So creating some room for some smaller play features in a boat seemed very fitting to be along the edge of this Great Lake escarpment. There's an idea of just one of many products or ideas of what that boat might look like. We've also had some fun discussions of how to use some of the existing trees that we're removing and actually using some of the stumps as a feature and embedding them into the hillside in this garden called a stumpery, which was brand new to me. Mark, the garden horticulturist, Mark Conlock, introduced me to this idea, which is just fantastic. And she showed me some of these images happening in England and European gardens where these stumps are embedded with plants and ferns and create this almost eerie, mystical landscape that wraps you along the craggy edges of the stone. A couple images of what that looks like in our model. And a couple snapshots of what that looks like today. So the entrance to the tunnel, if you look at this lower left image, the entrance to the tunnel would be just off here where I'm circling. So we're building up a little bit of the earth to extend off of the Hobbit house. All right, our next space, I think this might be our last one, the lodge. So this brings us back up to where the butterfly garden was most recently in that hoop house, if you're familiar with the garden from this last year. So this is occupying that space, and it's creating a large shade structure or pavilion where, again, field trips might have their lunches here. It's a larger space for, again, 30 plus people to gather here with a patio space and furniture out front. In a flexible lawn area, you can kind of see actually some of this hatched line work of the footprint of the butterfly house. So we're gaining back some of that space and creating a lawn that can be used for picnicking and flow in and out of this structure. This is an image of what that might look like. And I think there's a tie here again to Wisconsin's history and some of the heavy timber structures and logging and a lot of these type of masonry, big stones and large chunks of wood that are familiar to us, and some of the cabins and lodges from northern Wisconsin. The focal point of this structure would be an oversized stone fireplace that's anchoring the back side of it. And part of this structure actually, so this lower wall carves into the earth to retain a couple feet of grade and allows us to create a nice level platform on the top. There's an image of the hoop house and the butterfly garden. So that is the space that we are looking at. Woo! All right. We just went through a lot. Again, I'm not used to doing so much talking and not listening. So I hope we've sparked your imagination and your interest with the vision that we've portrayed for the garden as a whole, but also some of the details. The magic is in the details, right? That's what they say. And a lot of those details are what's ahead of us in terms of process. So I think there's a lot of work, there's a lot of fun work still ahead of us. But we are very excited about the state of the design and the plans as it is right now. I hope you are too. Just from a very high level, I know some of you are probably wondering how this all happens and what the timeline looks like. So as I mentioned, we are in design development right now. So we are, although it looks very colorful and sketchy, what I've showed you today, there's a lot of technical details that are being crafted in the background. And we are creating a technical document set using this presentation that we looked at today as kind of the game plan, the playbook for that technical document set. And our intent is to present that to the garden board in late March. And then we will enter into a fundraising period over this next year. And we anticipate that probably launches us into those construction documents and further detailing and engineering in the fall of this year, potentially with construction beginning in the spring of 2022. And then that is anticipated to last roughly a year and having a grand opening in spring of 2023. Depending on how fundraising goes, it might be one complete project or it might be phased. That's something that's on the table but still being discussed.